Hi guys, this is Nadia from Ibali Crafts, and today I want to show you how to make these scroll earrings. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and the little bell to get updates on my latest tutorials. I quite often make kits and PDF tutorials as well as template frames for the designs I put on YouTube, so I'll pop a link in the description and you can pop over and see if there's anything you fancy. Right, so let's get started. So because this is a pair of earrings, I tend to make both components, matching components at the same time. So this is one of the templates I was talking about earlier. So you can either draw it on a piece of paper, like I did before I started with the earrings. So I made a design, or else you can get this template from my shop. As I said, there's a link in the description. So for this sort of design, I've used my finest round nose pliers that I have. So these have got a very narrow tip, so that lets me create tiny scrolls. They're quite strong as well because they're quality. So what I'm doing here is I'm squeezing the end of the wire, and what that does is it creates a taper. In other words, that very fine tip that you see in the scrolls is created by me squeezing, very technical term, squeezing the end of the wire, and that brings it to a point. And as I squeeze, I also roll, so that gives me that round shape. So once I can't go any further, I bring in my chain nose pliers and I shape the swirl using a bit of pressure, and then go back to my round nose pliers, and I just kind of work with both those tools to get the shape I want. So I always reference back to the drawing, and it's quite important to have the pointy end of the swirl actually lie in the exact same position as the swirl on paper, because that will make sure that the shape is the same. So I've recreated all of those components that were on paper, and I make sure that they actually match up like so. And then the next step is to file the ends of the smaller swirl, because we want to narrow it down to actually match up and create a nice fluid sort of movement. So for that, I'm using a jeweler's file, which is half round. So if you don't have a Dremel like you will see just now, you can use this, because it's something that most jewelry makers will have at home. So it's a file half round, and I just bring this down to a narrow point. If you have one, you can use a Dremel. And the bit that I'm using here, I can't actually remember exactly what it's called. It's some sort of abrasive stone. You get these on eBay. If you put in sanding stones or something similar for Dremel, you'll find loads of those. And this is much quicker than to use your half round file, and you have much more control over the shape and all of that with this sort of stone. So I'm shaping it, and I'm bringing the tip down to a very narrow ending, so that it shapes around the swirl at the top. So once I'm done with this, I will then lay it against the shape to make sure that it fits. You can then also adjust it. So this is what it looks like once I have brought it to a narrow point. You can see it's nice and tapered, and make sure it fits around the actual swirl, the bigger swirl. So I'm going to lay this on my charcoal brick. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more just now. So first of all, I'm going to line this up like so to make sure that it all fits. You can see the point leaves a little bit of a gap at the top, and I'm just bringing in my pair of pliers in a second to make sure they fit. So I'm squeezing it together to make sure there's no gap, and you can do this gently. So I've also made sure, you've seen me here bring in a bezel cup, and the reason for that is I want to make sure before I solder the swirl in place that this bezel cup has enough space to fit in there, because it's nothing worse to solder it all and then find out it doesn't fit. Ask me how I know. Right, so once we've done that, you obviously take your one earring and flip it to the other side, because obviously we're creating mirror images. So we are now laying these on top of each other, and I make sure that there is no gap. So when soldering, solder needs to flow between two pieces of metal that are touching, otherwise it won't create a bond. So here I'm using a borax cone and some water. Also, you get this on eBay. This is the simplest flux you can get, and it's also quite neutral and environmentally friendly, I believe so. And I am just creating a little paste with that, and I'm painting it on everywhere I want the solder to flow. Your solder won't flow if you do not use some form of flux. There are many different types of flux. I've just started with my borax cone, and so far it works quite well for me. So I've got little tweezers here, and I'm arranging the scrolls to make sure that they fit. So next I've got my solder, and you get easy, medium, and hard. So when you are soldering, when you have multiple solder joints like we're going to have in this piece, you start off with your hard solder, because this has the highest melting temperature. And the reason being for that is when you create subsequent soldering joints, you don't want your first solder joints to melt into a puddle. Again, ask me how I know. So when you are doing your first joints, you solder with your hard solder, and any subsequent sort of joint, you will still try and use as much of the hard as you can. And if it's not possible anymore without melting your joints, you then move on to use medium solder. So I'm going to pick up a small section, and again you place it onto the flux. So you cut very, very tiny amounts of solder, and literally fraction of a millimeter long. Anyway, this is how I do it. Everybody's different, but I find that it creates much less of a mess if you're using tiny bits of solder. And if your wires touch and you've got enough flux, this is all you need, and it's much neater than as if you're using tons of flux and massive pieces. So I'm putting my solder pieces everywhere I want solder to flow. So they're so small. I'm quite thankful for those tiny little tweezers that I have. And also I should have fluxed those before, so I'm going to bring in my little paintbrush, which is quite handy to have obviously when you're using your flux. And I'm using a tiny bit of the borax mixture, and I paint it on top of the little what do you call them, flakes of solder, I guess. So once we've done that, we're going to use our torch. So when soldering, you're supposed to heat up the whole piece equally and not just point the flame and towards your solder. So you want to make sure that every part of the design is heated equally, which will then help the solder to flow. And your solder flows when you see a silver flash. And as you can see here, my pick helps me to keep the scroll in place, because once the flux heats up, it kind of expands and shifts your design. So you want to make sure that you keep the components in place. You can use a third hand for that as well, as you will see later on. I'll be showing you how I use mine. But this is how it works. So once you've soldered, use a vinegar and salt solution. It's just vinegar, full vinegar. Some people mix it with water and a teaspoon of salt, and that will get rid of all the fire scale, or some of it at least. When you use it with copper, it kind of makes the copper a little bit dull. So I don't know if your sort of commercial solutions are better for that, but this is all I use. It's fantastic. I like using it because it's environmentally friendly as well, and it gets rid of all the fire scale. So I've got some nice clean solder joints because we only used a small amount of solder. So next I'm going to create a little loop that is for the earring findings, and I'm going to create my own jump rings, and I'm using bell making pliers, which have got different sized mandrels. They're quite useful to have for this sort of application. And I'm just creating jump rings using some 0.8 20 gauge wire, and I'm going to cut this off. Now, if you're going to use them to attach things, you want to make sure that they are cut flush. So I'm always using, this is my flush cutter. This is a Tronix, which I absolutely love because it's got a very flush side and it's very fine tipped as well. So I make sure that each time I cut the jump ring, I flip the wires of the pliers to use the flat side to cut the wire where it joins up with the previous cut end, and that just makes sure that the sort of joint is flush. It's not too important in this section because what we're going to do later is cut the jump ring in half anyway, but this is how I make my jump rings. So once we've got a jump ring, I'm going to then cut it so that it fits to the top. So here I'm using my flush cutters again, and I'm going to cut roughly about 2/3 of the wire off the bottom, and I'm leaving a little bit at the top, actually more like half, I guess. So that's what it looks like so far, and you cut both of them at the same time. And then next you want to create a little chamfer because you want the place where we're going to solder it on is rounded. And as I mentioned earlier, solder will not bridge a gap. It will only solder pieces solidly together if the two components actually touch. So the more of an area where the two pieces touch, the better your solder joint will be. So I'm just creating a little angle roughly, and I'm going to place this against the loop at the top. So you need to determine where you sort of midpoint is as well. So this is the third hand tool that I was talking to you about earlier, and this is holding the jump ring up slightly higher than the actual earring itself, because obviously the wire is slightly thinner, so you don't want it to sit flat at the bottom. So I'm using this to hold the jump ring in place, slightly elevated. And then, as you can see here, this time I'm not using my tweezers, but I'm using the paintbrush with the borax solution on it to pick up my solder pellets and place it on the joints. So for this, I'm still going to use hard, just because I can. The piece we are soldering is, a fair bit away from anything else that has got hard solder on it, so I am happy to use hard. Again, obviously different people do things differently. So I'm just placing this against the jump ring, and using my pick again, I will hold this in place because as I said earlier, the borax tends to kind of expand. You can see the insert on the left here. I've tried to make it a little bit bigger so you can see what's actually happening when I use the torch. So again, using my pick here, and I'm trying to keep the flame away from the rest of the piece this time, so I'm kind of heating the area at the top so that I won't melt the rest of the solder joints again, because I'm using my hard wire, and I'm using the pick to kind of push against the third hand until the solder flows. I love using my charcoal brick to solder because it kind of keeps the metal a little bit cleaner than if it was with a fire brick. It creates an oxygen-free atmosphere around the solder, so it keeps fire scale from happening basically. And you can also create little divots in it, which I will show you just now when we are going to create our granulations and little balls. And that's what it looks like so far. And again, obviously pop it into your pickling solution, which is again salt and vinegar. So when I create little balls, I tend to use, if I have to create balls that are the same size, I cut wires of the same length each time. That means that the balls I will get from that are going to be the same size. So if you want to create 5 different balls that are slightly bigger each time, you cut, I cut 5 mil, then 1 centimeter, then 15 mil, then 2 centimeters, and so forth. Now, once I have done that, I take the smallest piece or whichever piece you want first, and I place it in a little divot. So this is a torch that I am using. So this is an Iroda PT550, which is fantastic because it is a step up from your creme brulee kitchen torch, because it's a little bit more powerful. And they're not that expensive. I think I paid about £30 for mine or so, so it works really quite well. And it has really worked well for most jobs for me. And if you use a charcoal brick as well, which creates a little bit more heat than, say, your fire brick, you really have enough heat to solder most things. Anyway, it's worked for me, so I really like using it and I recommend it. So you can search for these things, and they're sort of commercial butane torches. All right, so I'm going to heat up, and you can see I've placed the little piece into a little divot that I've created on my charcoal block, and it creates a little ball pretty quickly. So again, I'm placing it into my solution here, and it really helps to get rid of the fire scale, and I really like it because you can just chuck it away later without, any adverse effects. So next we're going to solder these little balls. I've only made 2 balls for this because I thought that would be enough to try and solder these. So we're placing those. You can put them wherever you want. I thought they look quite nice in the sort of, little crevices. And also when you put a ball where a swirl is, it prevents it from hooking onto clothing and other things, or hair or something like that when you wear it. So next, obviously, we're going to use our flux and paint it round and on the ball and on the wire. And next we're going to bring out our solder. So because these balls are obviously very near other joints, I'm going to move to medium solder. So this time you can see me try and pick it up with fluxed up paintbrush, which is actually much easier as well because you can pick it up much easier, and at the same time you're fluxing it. This solder actually came from pieces of wire which I've just cut into tiny little pieces and then put in boxes, because so much quicker when you're creating several different pieces than stop and cut each time. So I find this quite useful to have. So once we've fluxed up, we're going to do the solder. So obviously I don't want anything else to melt into a puddle again, so I'm periodically moving the flame away from the piece just so that I can keep an eye on the color or the look of the flux itself, because once it's ready to flow it goes pretty quickly, and then once it's ready to flow, silver is quite close to the melting point of hard solder, so everything will melt into puddle if you're not careful enough. So I move, as I said, my flame away occasionally just to see. So now I'm doing the bottom one. So if you can have a look at the inset, hopefully you can see how it looks when it actually melts, or flows rather. So once again, you're done with this, and everything, if your joints were nice and clean. It's also quite important actually to keep the wire or the metal, whatever you're soldering, clean. So that's why you periodically put it in pickle in between, because if you have dirty metal and like fingerprints or anything like that, your solder won't flow. Right, so that's what it looks like. So far so good. And now I'm going to solder the bezel cup. So one thing with the bezel cup is when you're soldering it, I'm going to solder it from the front. So I'm placing flux wherever I want the solder to flow. Now it's important not to solder the rim of the bezel cup, because obviously going to use that later to fold over the stone. So try and only solder at the base, so that you have enough of metal left over to be able to bend over the stone later on. So for this I'm going to use easy solder, because obviously right to the middle of everything, and this solder flows at the lowest temperature. From what I've heard as well, if you use easy solder, it kind of lowers the value of your silver pieces. I'm not 100% too sure how it works, so I'm going to need to read up on it some more. I've used it in this piece in any case, but there's something to think about for future. So I've used easy solder anyway, because I really don't want this piece to melt into a big puddle. So going to use it for that. So placed it all around the solder cup. As I said, make sure that you do not solder the walls of it. So again, just a very slight touch with your torch, and as I said, the easy solder really actually goes pretty quickly. So again, I'm using my soldering pick to kind of move the cup into the direction of where the solder is. So the solder will always follow heat. So wherever the heat is, the solder will follow. And I'm going to use the sort of soldering pick to push towards that direction as well and manipulate it in that way. And you can see I sort of what do you call it, flowed, I guess, pretty quickly, and it's actually quite solid. So even if you only have like 2 connections soldered to the bezel cup, that's actually enough for this to hold it in place. So that's that. So next, obviously, we need to set the stone. That's what it looks like so far. Once it's a little bit cleaned up and polished. So before we actually set this stone, this is a 4mm amethyst, and this is a 4mm bezel cup. So they kind of made the bezel cups to hold 4mm stones. I think they're about 4.5mm outside diameter and 4mm on the inside to house stones. Now obviously, you know, there's always a bit of a calibration issue with different stones, so I always try and get calibrated gemstones so that they fit the bezel cup. I think there's ways and means that you can sort of burr and grind out the cup if a stone's too big. It's slightly more difficult when the stone's too small, so you'll need to get a different stone basically. So what I'm doing here, as I was talking earlier, the side walls of the bezel cup need to be folded over the gemstone. So there's various different tools that you can use. There's pushers and burnishes and all sorts of things. So I'm just playing around with different things, different tools, until I find something that I like, that works for me. It's not really set in stone, excuse the pun. So use whatever works for you. Obviously, I made a mistake with one of the cups and I damaged the cup, which doesn't look great. So try not to ruin it with something that is harder than silver. So here I'm using an agate burnisher, which is really nice. As you push the metal, it also, you know, burnishes and polishes it to a shine. So I quite like using this, and it folds it over the stone itself. And you just obviously keep doing this until the stone is set. So far so good. Sometimes you can push it into place. Obviously be careful that you don't press too hard, because the stone can easily be damaged if you do that. And just keep pushing against the bezel. I tend to start on different points and then work my way around. So next we're going to create the ear wires. So obviously this, again, I'm cutting the wires at the same time, and I'm going to create a ball on one end. So very simple. Again, I'm using my torch. As I said earlier, your creme brulee torch works for that. 0.8 is not probably sort of the upper limit of what you can melt with a normal kitchen torch. 1 mil probably still works, which is your 18 gauge, but it'd be a bit more difficult. But yeah, as you can see with my Aurora torch, this works really, really well. And so create a little ball, and then obviously try and do the same thing with the other wire, and create the same sort of length of ball. And then once we've done that, we're just going to create a shepherd's hook. So we're going to make a tiny little loop where the ball is. This is going to be where we're going to hook the earring in. And once we've done that, I'm going to use the sort of second largest mandrel on my bell making pliers, fold it over and make it meet up with the loop. And this is the ear wire itself, and that's what it looks like so far. So if you don't have any, you know, earring hooks, you can just really easily make your own. There are many different ways of creating shepherd's hooks. This is just one of them. And this is it. That's the whole design done. I really hope you're going to enjoy creating these. I certainly did. I had a lot of fun making this design, and soldering is always such a fun thing to do. And don't forget to subscribe. As I said earlier, I also do PDF tutorials, kits, and if you want a frame for this, is also available in my shop. I would absolutely love it if you would come and join me on my social media, which is on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram is my favorite. Everything is under imbalicrafts.com. And last but not least, if you like to be part of our artist community, we found on Facebook under Wire Wrap and Jewelry Artists Worldwide. Again, I'll pop a link in the description. And